Hey, welcome to One Earth Live, everyone who's tuning in. I'm here with Clover Hogan, who has been an impassioned activist for almost a decade, from green school to working with Impossible Foods and Leaders Quest and all kinds of amazing projects around the world. Um, I want to give you a warm welcome, say what's good. Yeah, I think I'd like to start off by asking kind of what you've been focusing your attention on and putting your energy into in the last few months, in the light of this crazy situation that's sort of happening around the world. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you've been up to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for having me, first off. Um, yeah, so my kind of area of obsession, I suppose, since coming into the world of activism has been really why we respond to crises in the way that we do, with specific emphasis on the ecological and climate crisis. So really understanding why it is that we shut down in the face of planetary problems and what we can do to mobilize people so that they can kind of circumnavigate their despair and anxiety and all of the feelings that come up in the face of these problems. So we've been working with lots of young people around the world through Force of Nature to help them actually channel those emotions and those feelings into tangible action and really shift from anxiety to agency. In the past few months, in light of COVID, we've seen this explosion in mental health difficulties. Young people are feeling very disconnected, they're lacking a sense of purpose, and for many young people, they had sort of found their outlet for agency and activism through grassroots mobilizing. We saw the Youth Strikes for Climate, young people literally banner blazing in the street, and channeling that emotion that way. Now that mode of activism has been taken away, COVID, if anything, is acting as a sort of amplifier for a lot of those feelings of uncertainty and powerlessness. And it's really difficult. I think we feel like we're kind of swimming through this soup of anxiety and fear, and perhaps the worst part is just not knowing how long we're going to be in this kind of new reality for, this new paradigm. And so it's really hard to kind of plan for the future. It's hard to know where we're going to go. And, many of the feelings that come up around climate change are also coming up here. So, touching on this feeling of powerlessness, in the climate world, we're often told that the best thing that you can do for the environment is like buying a reusable coffee cup or turning off the lights when you leave a room. And it kind of feels similar when you're being told to just wash your hands in the face of a pandemic, right? Our individual actions don't really stack up to the scale of the problem. So for all of those reasons, a lot of young people are really, really vulnerable to mental health problems at the moment. So we're doing everything that we can to be able to support them and really help them try to inspire change in the world from their living rooms.
Hmm, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I think that there's definitely things that are, the challenges and struggles that people go through have been heightened. And I think also there's been a lot of space to reflect and to kind of address some of the patterns that we've been existing in for the longest time. I think I'd be curious to see in on the other side of that, acknowledging all the difficult things that are coming up for people. What are the things you've seen that have been positive that have been coming out of this situation, and what makes you hopeful, or how do you think that those things can be addressed moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you touched on a really important point, which is that we've kind of been forced to press pause on our hyper consumptive, globalized throwaway culture. And in that is a huge amount of potential and possibility, but it can also be really, really uncomfortable. And I've kind of found that dissonance within myself, the desire to go back to business as usual and go back to normal and do the little things like going and working from a coffee shop, right? But then realizing that going back to business as usual, we can't do it, right? Because business as usual was terrible for people and it was terrible for the planet. So as we take this moment in, it's really about thinking, what actually do we want to leave behind? We have this incredible opportunity to think about the kind of future that we do want to emerge into post-COVID, and how we can begin to seed those pockets of the future in the present. And I think that's the really incredible thing, is that, so many dystopian Hollywood blockbusters tell us that, in moments of crisis, humans become these horrible, greedy, self-interested beings. And we've actually seen, in light of this, just the ability for people to come together collectively in the interest of the greater whole. What happens when you kind of center yourselves not around this rat race and competition and comparison, but connection and contribution and working together. And, again, so much of how we were living is just broken. We live in these hyper urbanized environments. More often than not, we don't even know who our next door neighbors are. And so for the first time, we're thinking, oh, wow, I have a community around me. And not only do I have a responsibility, but I have a role to show up in that community and look out for them. So I've seen some really incredible people kind of stepping up to that challenge and throwing the whole narrative around survival of the fittest on its head, to show just what we're capable of when we think of ourselves not in the individual and not based in the ego, but really in the universal and collective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the most globally unifying situations we've had in a long time, just as far as everyone is implicated in a similar way. And I think in another sense, we have such a direct impact on our immediate community as well, and a responsibility to uphold their health and well-being as well. Yeah, it's interesting. I think something I've been thinking a lot about, you said returning to business as usual and how harmful our previous modus operandum has been. Part of my curiosity has really been around, what does it take for us to actually move to a new normal? What do we need to do collectively to shift our behavior moving out of this, so that we can, stepping forward, address and face not only the issues that we're facing that are critical and crises right now, but the things that have been, that we've been facing for a long time, that we haven't necessarily been addressing with the urgency that we've seen here. I mean, we've seen people mobilize and shift behavior so quickly, and just wondering, what do you think needs to happen in addition to that, to address the other issues that we're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when we talk about the kind of opportunity, one of the first things that really struck me was that many of the systemic kind of changes that we've been demanding for the past few decades, long before either of us were born in the climate space, were made possible in a matter of weeks, right? When there was the political will and social momentum. And that I found really awe-inspiring, because I was like, okay, hold up. Many of the things that we were told could not be done have suddenly been done in a matter of weeks. So on that level, I think we see how change can come about. But as you said, there is a level of systemic change that needs to happen in terms of how we structure our society, the values around which we kind of rally. We've all become very complacent with this sort of narrative of capitalism and limitless growth with finite resources. And moments like this show us just how fragile those systems are, and show us as well that they're not written in stone in the way that we kind of subscribe to them. Yuval Noah Harari talks a lot about narrative and story in society, and the fact that the one thing that kind of distinguishes us as a species is our ability to subscribe to those stories. They can be wonderful stories of another future that is possible, as Charles Eisenstein talks about, or they can be stories about why our purpose in life is to fulfill a certain figure salary, or is to go into the 9 to 5, or to go through an education system that tells us we're really stupid, right? So, we have all of these kind of, this sort of reckoning that's happening right now, where we look at just how fragile those stories are, and the idea that we can actually begin to rewrite them, and we can start to rewrite them on an individual level. The thing that fascinates me around, climate and ecology is that we have had for some time all of the, technology to be able to solve these problems, right? And we haven't solved them for lack of, man or woman power or resources or, money, anything. It's entirely to do with, tenacity and uncompromising resolve and a clarity of what we actually want to make happen. And so for me, the most exciting kind of shift that needs to happen is one of mindset and one of belief system. And that can seem super grandiose, but less so when you think about it from the individual kind of perspective. So one of the reasons why I feel like, this moment in time is super confronting is that we have subscribed to these kind of broken systems. We've been complicit in creating them and being complacent around them, whether that's the sixth mass extinction or it's the fact that, our clothes come from a factory in Bangladesh that deprives a 12-year-old of her education, right? So we've kind of been okay with all of this and we've numbed ourselves to it. And in large part because we don't actually know what to do. We feel so tiny in contrast to the scale of the problems. And so in this moment of pause, one of the most powerful things that we can actually do is like look in the face of all that's wrong and look in the face of our grief, and actually begin to dive deep into those feelings. We're also in a sort of society that promotes positive psychology and says that you always have to be, okay and good and switched on and your best self, and there's such thing as good emotions and bad emotions. And I think now is really the time where we need to look in the face of those quote unquote bad emotions, to think about what we've been numbing ourselves to. And in traveling through that fear and grief about, the harm already inflicted on the planet and the harm that we are still going to be inflicting on the planet, we can begin to think about how we can sort of redeem ourselves through, taking action, through deciding which problems we want to take on, through deciding that we're going to stay awake and that we're not going to kind of brush these problems under the carpet. So for me, in response to your question, the shift, the transformation that needs to happen is very much one of psychology and very much one of mindset.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that also a lot of people are being so bombarded by intense and confronting and frightening information at the moment that that there's such a high barrier to actually facing the things that we're confronted with. Oftentimes, I know within myself sometimes it's difficult to even go there because there's so much, and so wondering, what are some of the things that you are a proponent for as far as like facing the things that we're confronted with? Because I feel like that's something that you've been involved with in a long time in addressing eco-anxiety. And now in the face of this crisis, the kind of anxiety that's emerging, what are some of the things that you would suggest for this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And you touched on a super important point, which is that, there's on the one hand kind of waking up to the problems, and then there is falling into a pit of kind of nihilism. And similarly, I kind of avoid all mainstream media because the moment that I go into Twitter, the moment that I start reading the headlines, it's just this sort of this black hole, and you get sucked in. And, no matter how kind of strong or fortified you are, emotionally, it's really hard not to be super porous to that. And, I think also, mainstream media, you can't think of it as impartial, right? It has an agenda, and that agenda is based on headlines that are designed to, scare people and to suck them into that. And, one of, my frustrations, even earlier this year, we published an article in The Guardian around climate anxiety. And it was great because it brought it into the mainstream, but reading it back, it didn't leave anyone with any sense of agency or, oh, okay, here's what you can actually do about it, right? And it's very unusual to get any of that in mainstream media. So I would say, definitely limit your time buying into those headlines, but expose yourself to the things that you can change. So when you read kind of this ticker of how many people have died in the virus, it's just super overwhelming and inundating. And of course, you're going to kind of shut off from that as a natural coping mechanism. But that in itself is super unnatural, right? So we need to expose ourselves to things that we can have a real sense of agency over. And do so as well from a place not of this is the end of the world, but where is the opportunity here? So, when we work with young people in the classroom, many of them have these really kind of dystopian views of the future. I know that the future that my parents used to talk about was one of like flying cars and disease being eradicated. And since then, I've been working with, 11-year-olds who say, I'm not going to be able to have kids because there's not going to be a planet to live on. So the level of sadness and grief is enormous. And in those instances, young people are dialed into the problems, they see through the BS, but you can create an invitation to help them look in the face of those problems through the context of what can I actually do about them. And the way that we do that is, rather than kind of overwhelming yourself by looking at all of the world's problems and sort of spreading yourself thin across, this sort of token action or coffee cup activism, sometimes refer to it, doing all of the micro things. Think about the one thing that you most want to solve in the world. So think about the one problem that really ignites a fire in your belly, whether that is prison reform, or it is microplastics from the fashion industry, or it's the fact that a third of the world's food is wasted every day. Like, get that clarity of cause and then go even further with it to identify your kind of target, the problem within the problem, and then think about how there is an opportunity to invite a better, brighter future by solving that problem, and to solve that problem according to your unique skills and passions. So we have this kind of Venn diagram, force of nature, that we reference a lot, which is, on the one side, you have your kind of pain point, so the problem that you most want to solve. On the other, you have your passion. And at the junction of these two things is where you really find your power. So, one of the things I think that we've really failed at in the sustainability industry is that we've spent so long reacting against the problems that perhaps we've failed to take pause and think about what it is that we're actually working toward. And so much of this is thinking, all right, where do we want to be tomorrow? Where are we today? And how can I be a bridge between those two places? And in doing that, you suddenly center yourself as well in a place of contribution and connection. And it's incredible how kind of being in service of something that is bigger than yourself can really instill such a great sense of agency in a way that you can't really let all of the self-limiting beliefs and doubts about yourself get in the way, because actually the mission is that much more important. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question.
Yeah, and I think another thing is that once you've identified those things you're passionate about and the problems that you feel compelled to address, there is such a critical need for resources to understand how to cultivate that agency within yourself and to be effective within the space. I think that platforms like what you're building is so important for that, because in the absence of that, people can get really lost, even individuals. So I think that, just want to honor the work you're doing in that space, because it's really critical.
Thank you. Yeah, and I suppose that's part of the thing as well, is that, climate change, the ecological crisis, it may be, the greatest threat we've ever faced, that any generation has ever faced. But I like to think that it's also the biggest opportunity, because, often we talk about the relationship between social justice and climate justice, and that all seems very random and esoteric. But if you think about it, like, even if climate change didn't exist, it's not like the world was rosy, right? Like, climate change, is here because we have exploited indigenous populations around the world, because we have treated nature like an other, because we have not seen the value for the tree and the ecosystem services it provides, but for the table that it offers us, right? So there's so much that was broken that needs fixing. And, it's easy to kind of fall into that well of overwhelm and despair, but I feel so grateful and so lucky for the fact that I get to live in this moment in time, you know, and I get to think about how to be a custodian of a future by our own design. And, you know, the flip side of how royally we've screwed the planet is how many number of ways there are to help it. So, you know, the world very much is a 7.6 billion piece puzzle in which everyone has a place, and it's just about figuring out which of those pieces you kind of want to take on.
Yeah, amazing. I think just letting that land, because I feel that so strongly, the sense that you know, there's no better time to be alive if you are wanting to affect positive change on the planet. I feel like we really need to mobilize everyone as quickly as possible, all that solutionaries out there. Yeah, it's an intense time to be alive, there's no doubt about it. I think a curiosity that comes up for me is what are some of the aspects of the future that you're the story that you're writing for yourself? You know, before you mentioned that we have to rewrite the story that we tell, and that starts with each of us. Just wondering, like, what are some of the pieces of that for you, looking into the future?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, we touched on it earlier, which is identifying that we have sort of been fed a story that humans are fundamentally selfish and greedy, and that we've, you know, thrived as a species because of survival of the fittest and because of competition. And, you know, somehow that narrative continues to pervade, even though all social science and all evolutionary science shows us that, you know, it was survival of the fittest social group. You know, that's what has made us succeed, is our ability to collaborate with one another, to find common ground, to communicate. And, you know, but we live in a system that brings out the worst parts of humanity, right? Like everything that we're pushed toward reinforces extrinsic values, as we would say in psychology. So, you know, comparison, right? You go into social media and it's a rose-tinted window into everyone's lives, right? And it's so inauthentic, and it makes us feel really shitty about ourselves. So we have that. We, you know, have this education system where instead of, you know, asking young people which challenges they want to solve or how they want to be valuable members of society or acknowledging emotional intelligence, we kind of churn them through, like Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, sheep in a factory, to go and pursue careers that they have no love for, right? So there's so much that isn't kind of working. And we see then what happens when we ground ourselves back in those intrinsic values about working with one another. And it's not super complicated stuff. And I suppose what excites me working in the realm that I do around climate is that so much of this conversation has been happening in a closed door room, and climate has been talked about through the lens of, you know, polar bears and flashy solar panels and, you know, economic policy that's written by a bunch of, you know, old white men at, you know, the climate agreement, and then kind of distributed to the rest of society to implement. And we're like, no. Like, this very much is a grassroots movement. And I think that's what's incredible, is like when you set aside that very hierarchical kind of structure to think about how is this in fact an opportunity for every member of society to realize their place, you know, no matter the problem that they want to take on, no matter the skills and passions that they show up with. I want to live in a society that, you know, everyone has that equal access to opportunity. That for me is very much justice. That for me is equality, is just saying, actually, if there's a thing that you want to take on, we're going to support you to be able to do that. And so I suppose that's the future that I choose to subscribe to, and that's what really, really excites me. And it's also, I think, you know, working in the kind of eco-anxiety, climate anxiety space, for a long time as an activist, I thought that I had to beat those feelings into submission. And I was sort of subscribing to that old narrative around, you know, power. And I was thinking, you know, to show vulnerability, to show that weakness is a weakness. It's you know, not helpful, not constructive. And I think my sort of moment of reckoning came during the fires in Australia, and it was the first time that I had felt deeply patriotic and a deep sense of loss for my country and for my culture. And, you know, communities around the world have been experiencing that for decades with the exploitation of their natural worlds, with, you know, the subjugation of those communities. And so in the same way that you said this is kind of the almost like a leveling, like we're all affected by this pandemic, it's the same thing with the climate crisis. And that's what we need to wake people up to, is just appreciating what is at stake and what we have the potential to lose. And in confronting that potential loss and reconciling what we already have lost, we can find redemption by thinking, okay, well, here's the future that we want to emerge into, and here's the future that we want for our children and their children's children. That, I suppose, is the story that I get excited about.
Yeah, I like that story too. Wow. Yeah, the fires was a crazy situation out here as well. I was in Bali, I think, at the time, and I remember feeling that really heavily as well. Yeah, on a different level than previously, a little bit closer to home. The fires were very close to my home as well, and yeah, I think it's interesting because the climate crisis is affecting us all in slightly different and distinct ways, and I think that that's what makes it sometimes difficult to identify and kind of hone in on collectively. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. I guess the last question I'd love to ask you is, what are some of the things that bring you hope that that world is possible? What are the things that lift your spirits the most in striving for that world you just described so eloquently?
Definitely working with young people. I think, you know, that was a large sort of personal motivator for a starting force of nature and for working with young people around the world, was that I'd spent so much time working in these kind of boardrooms and with leaders who were so jaded by the world and kind of calcified by their own apathy and inaction, that it was just incredibly difficult to incite imagination or to see the vision of what was possible. And the incredible thing, by contrast, of working with, you know, 10, 11 through 18 to 24-year-olds is, you know, just how incredible the depth of imagination is. And that's what I think is, on the one hand, super confronting to a lot of people who kind of look to Greta Thunberg, for example. But I think she actually holds so many of the keys in a way, because she, you know, how do I want to say this? I suppose we learn to become complacent, and we learn to become the smallest version of ourselves, and we learn to become okay with the society as it currently is. And the incredible thing about a young person is that they haven't had all of that priming, and they haven't necessarily been around long enough for society to clip the wings of their imagination. So when they see a problem, there is no, you know, gray area, there is no nuance. They just say, this is wrong and this is right. And that's what you really get and harness from the young people taking to the streets en masse, you know, is that there's no question mark, there's no ifs or buts. They're saying this is do or die, right? Like it's profound, you know, that we have spent so long dragging our feet when the science tells us that we have less than a decade to transform every part of how we live, breathe, and exist, right? And so it's connecting to that sort of moral absolutism, which I find so empowering and so inspiring. And that is what gives me hope. And also what gives me hope is the realization that it's not like you pass a certain age and then suddenly you lose all of that and you lose your imagination. It's just a matter of rekindling it and kind of pulling off some of the masks that you learn to wear throughout your life. And, you know, what I found awesome is that when I have returned to these spaces in boardrooms and working with, you know, executives, universally, when asked what their catalyst moment was for caring about the climate crisis, caring about the ecological emergency, it was their child coming home at the end of the day and saying, what are you doing about climate change, right? And it's kind of like that World War I propaganda poster, which is like, what did you do in the Great War, Daddy, right? Like, it's this moment of, oh my God, what is my legacy going to be? What am I leaving behind to my kids? And in fact, there is such power in that intergenerational exchange. And, you know, for older generations, kind of reigniting that hope and agency of what is possible, and some of that fierce kind of frustration and anger, like letting that really bubble through. And then for young people as well, looking to the incredible trailblazers who have been working on sustainability and climate and social justice for 50, 60, 70 years. We have so much to learn about the kind of tenacity and resilience and uncompromising resolve that is required to take on these big, messy problems. So for sure, being in the classroom is what gives me so much hope. And it's just really, really fun because you ask young people like what problems they want to take on, and they come up with them in like 5 seconds, right? They're so dialed into that kind of like moral compass that it's just incredible.
Yeah, no doubt. I feel like that is a really good way to close this out. I would like to, extend a huge thank you to you for lending us your time and your ideas and your thoughts. How can people check out your stuff, learn more, get more involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find Force of Nature online by going to forceofnature.xyz. We're going through a big website redesign, which will hopefully be done by the time this goes out. And then you can also find me on social media at Clover Hogan. And my door is always open to anyone who wants to knock, have a conversation. So yeah, please do reach out 100%. And thank you so much. This has been a really, really fun, inspiring conversation, a good way to start the day.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. Have a good one, and I will speak to you soon.